Welcome to the debate.
It's good to be here.
So we've all experienced this, right? You're maybe 2 weeks into a new goal, could be the gym, maybe finally starting that big project, or trying to shift some, toxic routine, and then bam, the motivation just evaporates.
Mm-hmm. Definitely familiar.
And you find yourself, almost like you're not even in control, sliding right back into those old patterns you swore you'd left behind. Now, the material we're looking at today offers a really interesting perspective on this, suggesting it's not about weak willpower, not a character flaw, but actually a response to some deep, almost involuntary psychological coding.
Right. It shifts the focus away from blame.
Exactly. So the core question we're debating is really about primacy. When this habit failure happens, what's the essential, the most powerful driver behind it?
Okay.
Now, I'll be arguing that this return to old habits is fundamentally a systemic thing, a subconscious defense mechanism rooted in these pre-existing paradigms that prioritize familiarity and safety way above anything else. The problem is really the internal code itself.
And I'll be taking the view that while, yes, that subconscious resistance is absolutely real and it's a powerful barrier, focusing only on that system risks, well, minimizing the essential role of conscious, intentional commitment. The effort required to actually sustain the new behavior long enough for any kind of reprogramming to even start.
Okay, position stated. So, diving into my perspective first. The material makes it pretty clear that real sustainable change involves a battle between two systems. There's the existing structure, what the text calls the mental programming, or the paradigm. Think of it as this invisible set of beliefs, habits, and mental rules. It's like the mind's background operating system, basically defining what feels normal and even possible for you.
Mm-hmm. The OS analogy works.
And the crucial insight here, the thing that I think elevates this material, is why this system fights back so hard. Its core programming, deep down, is wired for safety, not for abstract goals like growth or, achievement. It sees anything new, even something obviously beneficial, like meditation or learning a valuable skill, as a potential threat. A psychological one, sure, but a threat nonetheless.
Because it prefers certainty?
Exactly. It prefers the familiar, even if that familiar thing is stressful or painful, because it knows it. It represents certainty. Neurologically, it's like saying, well, at least I know this place. It's safe here. So any attempt to build a new habit, the paradigm sees that as a system update. And what do old systems typically do when you force an update?
Resist? Crash? Slow down? Yeah.
They resist, they slow down, or they crash completely. This change gets registered instantly as potential danger, and boom, it triggers the amygdala, the brain's survival center. So when we feel that sudden crash, that boredom, that restlessness 2 weeks in, those feelings are just the nervous system signaling, whoa, stop, this is new territory. Let's get back to the old familiar routine. That's why I argue the paradigm's primacy as the source of this systemic resistance is the fundamental barrier to change.
Okay, that's a really compelling argument for the diagnosis of the problem. I absolutely see that. But, I come at it from a slightly different angle. While the existence of these paradigms and this systemic subconscious resistance is deeply compelling, it certainly explains why we fail so often. The material then pivots almost immediately to the solution, and it defines that solution almost solely as conscious repetition.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where I think a major tension arises in the framework. If repetition is, as the text clearly states, the only real language of the subconscious, then achieving that, fluent communication, it inherently requires a massive sustained conscious effort just to start and maintain that repetition loop, especially in those critical early days and weeks when, as you said, the amygdala is actively pumping out those signals of alarm.
Okay.
So I'm just not fully convinced that simply understanding the code, the paradigm, is enough to override it in practice. The text does tend to dismiss traditional ideas like willpower or laziness as the reasons for failure, but then its solution seems to rely entirely on the individual's capacity for sustained conscious action, their ability to actually deploy conscious repetition, to initiate new thoughts and new behaviors, specifically to override that powerful systemic pullback. So that necessary initial and sustained conscious effort, the sheer intentional force required to act against that deep-seated impulse for safety, that feels like the essential element that the focus on just the systemic mechanisms tends to minimize. Without really acknowledging the power required for that initial intentional override, the solution feels a bit incomplete, almost like it relies on some temporary, unexplained burst of superhuman drive to get started.
Okay, so that brings us right to the core of it, doesn't it? Interpreting this system resistance versus the requirement for conscious override. You're arguing that the problem is the mental programming, that systemic update failure. So when we revert, it's not some kind of moral failing, it's just the operating system defaulting back to the safest known code because, as the text says, the mind can't tell the difference between a real threat and a psychological one.
Right.
This mechanistic explanation, the amygdala sees new, flags it as potential danger, system defaults to safety, it frames the failure purely as a system response. The conscious mind might genuinely want to start that morning run, but the underlying system, running on the deep code of the paradigm, effectively rejects the physical effort, maybe making you suddenly feel terrible, unmotivated, or distracted. Fix the code, the argument goes, and the behavior naturally follows almost effortlessly.
And I agree completely that those resistance signals, the sudden feelings of boredom, the deep reluctance, the urge to check your phone instead of doing the hard thing, that is the nervous system responding to the unfamiliar. The diagnosis, the idea that this resistance is driven by a deep-seated fear of the unknown, I think that's spot on.
Okay.
However, overcoming those signals, that specific moment when you choose repetition despite feeling bored, despite the amygdala basically screaming danger signals, that requires an act of intentional override that feels far more demanding than just having an intellectual understanding of what's happening. It's kind of like standing at the edge of a cliff. You know intellectually you need to step forward for some reason, but every biological impulse is just screaming, danger, stay back. The knowledge that your brain is just trying to protect the familiar, that's excellent for diagnosis. It absolutely helps remove the shame, which is valuable. But that knowledge alone doesn't automatically grant you the power source needed to push through that initial uncomfortable, dangerous feeling phase. That power source, I argue, has to come from a conscious, sustained commitment, maybe not an infinite reserve, but certainly a non-finite one, a reserve of intentional strength that you can deploy day after day to overcome that automatic, non-negotiable drive for safety. Otherwise, the whole framework seems to circle back and rely on the very thing it tends to dismiss, that initial raw willpower or conscious effort.
See, I think we need to shift focus from just the initial diagnosis, maybe, to the actual scope of the solution presented. If, as the material strongly suggests, the solution is primarily mechanical, you use repetition so the new behavior eventually becomes familiar, and then it becomes automatic, meaning the habits change, because the person effectively gets reprogrammed, well then it's essentially describing a process of automated learning.
Right. Automation is the goal.
But wait, to achieve that automation, you first have to generate the sustained intentional effort for days, weeks maybe, often against intense systemic pushback. That's where I find myself asking, where does the fuel for that sustained generative effort come from? If the text dismisses traditional notions of intentional strength or willpower as finite and unreliable, yet its solution relies on what seems like an endless initial stream of intentional, conscious action, doesn't that create a paradox? It feels like the real failure point often isn't the final paradigm shift itself, but the collapse of the necessary effort required to bridge that gap between conscious initiation and eventual subconscious acceptance. You essentially have to brute force the action, maybe for those first couple of weeks, and that initial grinding phase, that's where the effort, not necessarily just the paradigm, seems paramount.
Okay, but I come at it from a different way, which I believe is entirely faithful to the text's logic and, frankly, to behavioral science. The material explicitly states the fight isn't between you and your willpower, but between you and your old programming. Now, if the effort relies solely on willpower, that conscious executive function we use for managing daily tasks, it is likely doomed to fail, precisely because, as research shows, willpower is inherently finite. It gets exhausted. This is exactly why motivation-based changes are often so fleeting. Why New Year's resolutions famously fail by February.
The finite resource argument.
Exactly. Repetition works, according to this model, precisely because it speaks the language of the subconscious directly. It's presented as a mechanic, a systematic process designed specifically to change the underlying code. By making the new pattern familiar through sheer repetition, you are effectively deactivating the amygdala's alarm signal, not through sheer force of conscious will, but through redundancy. The system learns, oh, okay, this new thing, it's actually safe. So the goal isn't to rely on constant conscious strength, which is kind of what you're describing, and which the material argues is unsustainable, but to automate the function so it no longer requires that conscious strength. The failure, therefore, is rooted in the existing system's resistance being stronger than the temporary willpower applied, which actually proves the paradigm's primacy over fleeting conscious motivation. We have to change the operating system, not just keep trying to manage its symptoms with temporary bursts of intentional force.
Okay. That leads us nicely into how we're defining the paradigm itself. Is it fundamentally about deep beliefs, or is it more about the observable habits? For me, reading the material, the core of the problem is the paradigm, that invisible architecture of beliefs and mental rules dictating what feels normal and possible for your self. It strikes me as a conceptual problem first, which then manifests as behavior.
So belief dictates action.
Essentially, yes. For instance, if your paradigm includes a core belief like, I am just not the kind of person who deserves success, or maybe I am incapable of maintaining discipline, then the system will almost inevitably sabotage new efforts because they clash with that core belief. It needs to align behavior back to the belief. Repetition, in this view, addresses this deep conceptual programming. By repeating the new behavior, waking up early, sitting down to write, whatever it is, you're essentially sending a message to the subconscious system saying, no, this is who I am now. This action is safe and it aligns with my new emerging identity. So the reversion, the slip back, is fundamentally a failure of the core conceptual system to accept that new self-definition, that new belief about what is possible for you.
I'm sorry, but I just don't quite buy that the belief shift must precede the effort, or is the primary driver of the resistance. Let me tell you why. While paradigms absolutely define the mental rules and those underlying beliefs, the system's initial and arguably most powerful resistance seems focused on the immediate, tangible unfamiliarity of the behavior itself.
Okay, the physical act?
Think about someone trying to start running. Sure, the paradigm might hold the belief, I'm not a runner. But the immediate systemic resistance they feel isn't just an abstract belief. It's the physical discomfort, the burning lungs, the internal monologue screaming, stop, this hurts, this is inefficient, go back to the couch. If the focus is purely on reprogramming the deep belief first, it feels like it underplays the sheer force needed just to execute the new physical or mental action repeatedly, despite those immediate pain and danger signals, until the action itself starts to feel normal and reaches the point of automation. Beliefs, in my experience, and often in psychological models, frequently don't shift until after behaviors have been sustained for a while. That initial, grueling, non-automatic execution phase, that's where the rubber meets the road.
Factor in initiating the solution rather than being minimized as just temporary willpower.
All right, so wrapping up my position then, we have established, I believe, a strong case that the systemic nature of resistance, rooted fundamentally in the subconscious drive for safety and governed by the pre-existing paradigm, is the definitive reason individuals consistently return to old habits. Lasting change, therefore, is achieved not by relying on fleeting motivation or that finite resource of willpower, but through the almost mechanical application of conscious repetition. This bypasses the limited executive function and, eventually, rewrites the core system code. The failure isn't a lack of trying hard enough in the moment. It's the system inherently rejecting the update for the sake of perceived biological survival and familiarity.
And summarizing my view, we certainly agree that paradigms and that subconscious resistance are fundamental, incredibly powerful obstacles preventing change. No question there. However, I continue to maintain that framing habit failure solely as a kind of system update failure risks minimizing the critical and frankly unavoidable role of conscious commitment required to actually execute that necessary repetition, especially against those initial powerful signals of danger, boredom, and restlessness. Understanding why you couldn't change before requires appreciating not just the psychological hurdle of the paradigm, but also the intentional day-in, day-out force needed to overcome the initial fear of the new behavior and simply sustain the effort until the subconscious finally, grudgingly perhaps, accepts the new code.
Indeed. This debate really illuminates, I think, that true transformation probably begins when one understands the really complex interplay between that deep-seated mental programming and the conscious effort that's clearly required to initiate and sustain new behavior.
Absolutely. There is clearly much more to explore in how these two systems, the conscious intention and the subconscious safety paradigm, truly interact, especially in those crucial first few weeks of attempting change, and maybe how we can best leverage both systems to move towards real, lasting transformation.